Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marilyn Fox, the Artistic Director of Pacific Resident Theater. We are so happy to have you here today for the second installment of our Artist Insight series. And we're thrilled and honored to have as our guest the Academy Award, Tony Award winning playwright, screenplay writer, translator, adapter, Sir Christopher Hampton, coming to us from London as our guest. And as our guest host today, the venerable Michael Peretzian, who's had a career as an international literary agent for 38 years and now has come back to be the thing that matters the most to him, an award-winning theater director. Hello, Michael.
Hi,
so
Marilyn.
Lovely to see you. The last time we saw each other, you were directing Cigarettes and Chocolate as part of our most appreciated 2019 season at PRT.
Yes, I enjoyed that very much, as well as a bit of reading we did at Pacific Resident Theater of Yasmina Riva's art, which Christopher Hampton adapted with Julian Sands, and that was really great. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to it, and without further ado, let me just give a full disclosure. I was one of Christopher Hampton's American agents, and not only was I working for him professionally, we became fast friends, and that all started well, a couple of decades ago, actually. So without further ado, let's welcome Christopher Hampton. Christopher, welcome.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to be with you.
Well, it's good to be with you too, and to see you, certainly without a mask, except I see your mustache and beard.
Yes, that's an addition during the coronavirus period.
Well, welcome. Let's put this first of all in context, what we're about to experience. I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, where it's about 80 degrees. Where are you?
I'm sitting in my study in London, in Notting Hill, where I've lived for the last 25 years. And yes, it's pouring with rain here.
Oh, wow. Well, that's too bad, but here we go. Let's start. I'm going to start taking you back a few years to when you were 18 and you wrote a play called When Did You Last See My Mother? Tell us about that experience. And certainly you decided to write, and curious about why a play as opposed to a novel or anything else.
Well, I'd always wanted to be a writer for reasons I can't really explain. There were no books in the house. My parents were all interested in sport, and my brother. And so I don't know why I wanted to be a writer, but I started in very young. I started writing plays when I was about 8 or 9. And I wrote a novel during my teens, which was wisely turned down by all the publishers I sent it to. So in the sort of innocence of youth, I thought, the novel doesn't seem to have gone down very well. I'll try writing a play. And in that period between leaving high school and going to Oxford, I wrote this play called When Did You Last See My Mother? And then, of course, I didn't know what to do with it. If you write a novel, you send it to a publisher. New plays were not very easy to get on in London in the mid-60s. So we actually managed to get it on as students in Oxford. Mm-hmm. And my big stroke of luck was that the Guardian newspaper, difficult as it is to believe in these days, actually sent a critic who gave it a very good review. And before I knew where I was, I got my play to the most celebrated theatre agent of the day, who was called
Right.
Peggy Ramsey, Margaret Ramsey.
Right.
And she persuaded the Royal Court Theatre to put the play on almost immediately on a Sunday night, when they in those days they did 6 or 7 times a year, they would do a Sunday night production without decor of a new play.
Mhm.
And it went very well, so well that they moved it into the West End, which started everything off.
Right.
So I was up
You
and
were
running, really.
in the West End. You're 20 years old, and you have a play on at the West End, the youngest playwright ever to have a play in the West End. What was that like? I mean, at 20.
Well, it wasn't as I mean, I didn't appreciate that it was as remarkable as it was.
Mhm.
I didn't, you know, it all happened so quickly, and it just seemed like a natural progression. And it was only later that I realized it dawned on me actually how
Yeah.
lucky I was. In fact,
Right.
I was doing a lot of interviews because I was so young. I was interviewed by a lot of newspapers,
Yeah.
and the producers very wisely sent a press agent out with me. And at some point between interview 8 and interview 9, I said, "Gosh, this is boring. I'm just hearing myself saying the same thing over and over again." And she said, "You just don't realize how lucky you are. Shut up and answer the questions. You know, try and appreciate what's happening to you."
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, right. Peggy Ramsey, agent extraordinary. I mean, tell us about her. I mean, here's the ex-agent asking about this, but she was. I just find that the English agents are more like editors. They're much more than bookers, let's say, as they may be more in this country. But what was she like? I mean, she was very instrumental, wasn't she, in getting you, for instance, the book to Les Liaisons Dangereuses. Am I right about that?
Well, she was an absolutely astonishing woman, and you know, when I had my first play on and I had some approaches from agents, I was lucky that somebody said to me, the best, by far the best agent for theatre is Margaret Ramsey. So I sent the play to her, and it was in the middle of a semester at Oxford, and I was sitting in my window reading a book. And at Oxford, we have these porters with kind of bowler hats, and one of them was coming across the quad towards me, and he said, "Mr. Hampton," and I said, "Yes." He said, "You're wanted on the phone." Well, I assumed that someone had died or something, because it was not the job of the guys with bowler hats to go around and find undergraduates to. Anyway, it was Peggy Ramsey, who by sheer force of character had said, "Go and find him and bring him to the phone." And then she commanded me to come down to London the very next day. And I said something like, I think there's a lecture on Baudelaire or something. He said, "Just come to London, shut up and come to London." So I did. And I was with her for the next 25 years. She was like a sort of second mother to me. And was very concerned that I was, you know, working hard and, you know, doing the right sort of thing. And she would ring me up at 8 o'clock in the morning and say, are you up yet? It's time to work." And actually, the only quarrel I ever had with her was that when I wanted to, I really did want to write films as well, and I decided that I wanted an American agent to be able to do that. And she was very, very upset about that, and said, "Well, if that's the sort of thing you want to do, then you better go." And I had to write her a very long letter explaining that I didn't want to write films because I wanted to make a lot of money. I wanted to write films because I really liked films. And she kind of eventually got that and helped. But you spoke about Liaison Dangereuse. In fact, it was one of the books that I was studying at Oxford. It was the period of literature I studied went from 1782 to 1920. This was called modern literature. And of course, La Liaison Dangereuse was written in 1782, so it was one of the first books I came across when I was about 19. And I fell in love with it. I thought it was an amazing, extraordinary novel. I still do. And I said to her one day, I think maybe it could be made into a play. And she said, do it.
I see.
And it then took me about 8 years to get around to doing it, but during which time she constantly nagged me and said, come on, you must do La Liaison Dangereuse. So she was very smart.
Right. So, okay, so then after that debut on the West End, you were the resident dramatist and literary manager at the Royal Court for many years, and that's where you were a very fertile period of writing during those days in the 70s.
Yes, well, When Did You Last See My Mother had been at the Royal Court, and a couple of years later, I was about to graduate, and I went down to the theatre to see a play, and I had a drink afterwards with William Gaskell, who was the artistic director there. And he said, what are you going to do when you leave Oxford? I said, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about it very carefully. I just hope, I sort of like to go on writing and so on, but I guess I'll have to teach or something to make ends meet. And he said, well, we can probably find you a job here. And of course, the Royal Court Theatre at that time, thanks to the sort of revolution that had been instituted by John Osborne in 1956 with Look Back in Anger, the Royal Court Theatre was sort of the center of the theatrical universe at that time. So it was an amazing invitation. And I said, yes, absolutely. What do you want me to do? And he said, well, he would apply to the Arts Council of Great Britain for a grant for a resident dramatist. And he got it. But he said, it's just a title, but I'm going to make you do everything. I'm going to make you read plays, write to other writers, have writers groups, travel around the country to see new plays wherever they may come on, write reports on them, go to rehearsals. So it was a sort of root and branch education in the theatre. It was the only problem was that I was so busy, I didn't have time to write a play. So I said to him towards the end of the first year, I said, look, you're keeping me so busy. I haven't got time to write. And he said, well, if you can get an assistant to work for you for £7.50 a week, and if you take a cut in your salary, then you can have an assistant. So I asked David Hare, who became my assistant, at £7.50 a week. And then I was able to write a play, which was called The Philanthropist, which turned out to be very successful and enabled me to make a living, really.
Right. That's wonderful. And of course, as an adapter, and a translator, you translated so many fine writers in terms of Ibsen and Moliere and Chekhov. Chekhov's at Seagull.
That all happened pretty much by chance as well. I was at university. I studied French and German, so I was technically a linguist. But the Royal Court at that very moment in the mid '60s, they decided, which was a kind of revolutionary idea at the time, that instead of doing the classics, that's to say Chekhov and Ibsen, in the academic translations that were published by Penguin, which was what people did, why not get playwrights to make new translations of these plays? So they got Angelico to do The Seagull, they got Edward Bond to do Three Sisters, and I was asked to do Uncle Vanya, which we did in, I think, 1970 with Paul Schofield. So it was such a marvelous experience to be able. I worked with a Russian woman who was incredibly specific about the language and, you know, detailed about it. And I would write an act at a time. And she was the editor of the Russian Penguin cookbook. So I go around and have these marvelous meals. And then she go through word by word pretty well the translation. And I just, it taught me that translating, spending two months sitting every day with Chekhov is not only a huge pleasure, but it's of course educational. It teaches you how these plays are made from the inside out. You know, it's taking the clock to pieces and putting it together again. Right. And so I started to do this quite a lot, and I've actually translated more plays than I've written, I guess.
Yeah. Your version of The Seagull, directed by Ian Ricketson in 2006 with Kristen Scott Thomas, came to Broadway. That was an amazing production, which I still remember very fondly. So, it's a real gift.
It was a very, very beautiful production. Ian was, again, he was the artistic director at the beginning of this century at the Royal Court. And 2006 was the 50th anniversary of the theatre, and
oh yes,
I did the translation to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Royal Court. But we were terribly lucky because we had Kristen Scott Thomas, we had Carey Mulligan who played Nina, we had Chiwetel Ejiofor who played Trigorin. It was a Mackenzie Crook who played Constantine, and it was just one of those productions. If you're lucky, every 10 years or so, there's a fantastic production that you're involved in, right? As opposed to a sort of standard production,
right?
And that was one of them.
Let's talk a little bit more about your experiences in terms of translations. For instance, how did you come to work with Yasmina Reza and that relationship that produced such wonderful productions like Art and so forth? I mean, and of course later we'll talk about Florian Zeller as well. But how did that come about?
Well, I translated a lot of dead writers, you know. I translated Ibsen, Chekhov, and Moliere, and
was that easier? Was that easier?
Well, the thing was, I didn't know this at the time, but I was actually working on a film in Paris, and around the corner from my hotel, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, there was this play called Art running, and I thought, what's a very interesting title. So I went to the box office and said, "Have you got a ticket for this evening?" And they said, "No, we're sold out for months." So I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I went back that evening and got a return ticket and went in and saw the play, and it was astonishing. And I went back to London. Peggy Ramsey had died by now, and my play agent was her right hand man was an American called Tom Earhart. And I said, "Tom, there's this amazing play in Paris. Can we get the rights?" And he said, "I'll look into it." And 2 or 3 days later, the phone rang, and he said, "No, I'm sorry, the rights have been bought by Sean Connery." I said, "Don't be ridiculous." He said, No, I promise you. Sean's wife went to see the play, and he's bought the rights. And I said, "Well, could you tell him I'd quite like to translate it?" And 2 or 3 days later, the phone rang again, and this famous Scottish voice was on the other end. It was Sean Connery inviting me to do to translate the play, which turned into actually the longest running foreign language play ever in London. It ran for 2,500 performances.
Right.
And it was very, very successful all over the English speaking world. Now, what I did discover working with Yasmina was that there are some difficulties and disadvantages of working with people who are not dead. In other words, they're likely to have an opinion.
Yeah.
So we've had a very friendly but quite combative relationship over, because I've done, I think, 6 of her plays now, and I always say that she couldn't really speak English very well when I first met her, but I always say she taught herself English in order to give me a hard time.
Yes, culturally, I mean, are there things, for instance, that would work well in a theater in Paris that may not work well in an audience in the West End or on Broadway? I mean, culturally, were there things that you had to translate in terms of a similar mode, or was that ever a problem?
I think what startled Yasmina was that the English audiences laughed so much.
Yeah.
In other words, she'd written a play which is a comedy, but it's quite a serious play at base about, friendship and 3 friends whose long-term friendship is falling apart because of arguments about a painting. Now, the English find it irresistibly amusing that people should care so much about a painting, about art. So when we first did the play and the curtain went up and Albert Finney and Tom Courtenay were standing on the stage looking at this white canvas, the entire audience started laughing before anybody had spoken a word. So I could feel Yasmina sort of shifting and shuffling beside me. And about 20 minutes into the play, she said, "What have you done?" She leaned across to me and said, "What have you done to my play?" Because the audience were laughing so much. And that makes her slightly uncomfortable. And it was the same with God of Carnage, which was her other very successful play that I did, which was even more successful on Broadway than it was in London.
Yeah.
I don't mean to make them as funny as that, but they are funny, and you might as well, but I don't change anything. I don't change anything, and I don't feel that the cultural, in fact, when we did, when we'd done God of Carnage in London, and then we came to do it in New York, and on the first day of rehearsal, James Gandolfini, who was a wonderful man, who was playing one of the 4 characters, said he didn't think the Broadway audience would accept him as a Frenchman, and could we kind of do something about it? And even Yasmina had to admit that he probably had he was probably onto something there. He probably had a point. So during the first week of rehearsal, we relocated the whole play to Brooklyn, and it actually worked. It worked because it's a universal subject. It worked. I don't know if it worked so well with art, which is very French. But with God of Carnage, it worked entirely effectively, being set in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and as long as we're in that area, I'd like to hear what you have to say about working with Florian Zeller. I mean, The Father recently was done here at the Passy Playhouse, directed by Jessica Kudansky, and very well done with Albert Finney. I'm sorry,
Alfred Molina.
Alfred Molina.
Yeah, I would love to have seen it. But I was anyway. I suppose what happens if you translate a play which is very, very successful, you start getting asked to translate lots of other French plays. And but I can't really translate a play unless I have an emotional attachment to it, or I feel that it's something I can I can feel personal about. So I heard about. I was interested in Florian Zeller, so I went over and saw a play of his called The Truth, which is a very funny play, comedy. And I went back to London and I said, look, I think it was a bit, I don't think it was very well directed in Paris. I think it seemed rather old fashioned. And I have a feeling that if you could get a really good director, it would seem much more contemporary, and so it was sent to lots of directors, all of whom turned it down. I'd become interested in Florian. So the next play of his was called The Father. So I went across to Paris to see it, and met him for the first time, and saw the play. And the play is a masterpiece. So I said to him, well, I'd like to translate it, and I think, he'd already written several plays by then. I think this should be the play of yours that introduces you to an English-speaking audience.
Yeah.
And we went from a very small studio theatre in Bath to a studio theatre in London, to the West End, to Broadway, and eventually we co-wrote a film last year, Florian and I, which Florian directed last spring.
On The Father? Yeah.
Yes, a film of the Father with Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Colman, which he directed brilliantly, and which was at the Sundance Festival in February. But you will have seen it in California with Alfred Molina.
So some of our audience may not know what The Father is about. Can you give us a brief little summary?
The play is about a man suffering from the onset of Alzheimer's, or anyway dementia. A disease of that kind. But the originality, the brilliance of the play, is that although it starts in what seems like an entirely realistic, conventional way, strange things begin to happen, and eventually we in the audience understand that we're seeing what's happening through the eyes of a man whose mind is deteriorating, and it makes it extremely painful and extremely powerful. The play. So that was another very good relationship that I have with a French writer, and I've done 6 of his plays as well.
Well, wonderful. Let's talk about directing. You directed Carrington in 1995 and Imagining Argentina in 2003. Do you like directing? I mean, you're directing your own work, but how do you feel about film and what you've done and what you would like to do more of?
I do like directing films very much. I directed Carrington, which was my first film, really because no one else would do it. It had been 18 years, and I'd always thought it was one of my better scripts. And I couldn't get it off the ground. And eventually I did get it off the ground with Thompson and Jonathan Pryce. And Mike Newell was going to direct it. But then some conflict of interest occurred, and he couldn't do it. And so one of the producers, who was a man called Philippe Carcassonne, a Frenchman, rang me up one night and said, will you direct it? I said, oh no, I've never really wanted to do that sort of thing. And he said, well, we've got the money, and in France we're quite used to writers directing their own films. So why don't you do it? So I said, well, give me 24 hours. And then Emma Thompson rang me up, said, go on, you do it. And so I then found it was, of course, much more enjoyable than writing. It was really enjoyable.
Right.
And I had the most marvelous summer making the film. And then, the film went to Cannes and it won a couple of prizes. So So I thought maybe something I should do more of. But then Imagining Argentina was a real struggle, and then it was a 6-month battle with all the 11 producers, and it just ate a year and a bit of my life. And then it was not well received when it came out. So I thought, well, maybe I should stick to what I know best. But I've recently been doing more directing in the theatre, which I enjoy very much. In fact, the reason I couldn't come to Pasadena to see Fred Molina was because I was directing a new play of mine based on a story by Stefan Zweig called Letter from an Unknown Woman, which I was in the middle of directing in Vienna. In fact, we did one preview and then the government closed the theatres in March.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going back in September to
Good.
to
Well, it just seems to me that that writing is such a lonely experience, and directing, you have a lot of people around you and a lot of other, you're
It's
not
true,
alone.
but it's true. But the beautiful thing about writing for the theatre, writing for actors, which is what I consider my job to be,
Yes.
is that you alternate between the solitude of when you're writing and the rehearsal room, which is where I most like to be and where I most enjoy being.
Of special interest, I think, for an audience here in Los Angeles is Tales from Hollywood, which was born here and had a very nice history after that. But tell us again about, how did this come about? How did this play come about, and where did it start?
Well, it was commissioned by the Mark Taper Forum. I'd had a couple of plays on there and had a good relationship with Gordon Davidson. And he called me, I think in 1981, to say that 1982 was supposedly 150 years after the founding of Los Angeles. And the Mark Taper was going to do a series of plays set, and the only restriction would be that they'd have to be set in Los Angeles. And so would I like to take this commission? It sounded intriguing to me. And I somehow the idea landed of writing a play about the emigre German writers, the people who were running away from Hitler in the 30s.
And Gordon's house, was that a place?
Yes, and Gordon Gordon Davidson actually lived in a house in Maybury Road, which had been the house of Salka Viertel, who was Greta Garbo's writer, and who was married to Bertold Viertel, who was a distinguished German director. So they'd lived there, and Brecht had been a house guest for many, many months. And so there was a whole lot of history around this house. And some of the plays indeed set in the house. And I spent at least a year, most interesting research, marvelous research time. And I was very happy writing this play, which I still think of as is my favorite of my plays. And we put it on at the Mark Taper, and it was not at all well received. Not at all well received. But luckily, it had already been accepted by the National Theatre in London. We did it there with Michael Gambon and Ian McDermott and Billy Whitelaw. And it was very, very successful there. And then luckily you directed it many years later when it was well received. So
yes,
so
at the
happy ending now.
Exactly, at the Odyssey Theater Ensemble in Los Angeles. Ron Saucy and Beth Hogan were producing it, and it was a really a wonderful experience.
Well, the play is about those. The thing is that there was this flood of refugees from Nazi Germany who arrived in Los Angeles, and the designers were fine, the directors were fine, the composers were fine. The people who were really, really unhappy were the writers, because they'd lost their language. They couldn't, and they all were put under sort of charitable contract by Warner Brothers and so on.
Right.
But they couldn't really write anymore. And it seemed to me a very sort of poignant subject.
Yes, Bertolt Brecht trying to write a treatment for Warner Brothers.
Yes, he was trying to write romantic comedies for MGM, yes, it's a very rich subject matter.
There's something, that I know that Hollywood always, I mean, Tales from Hollywood, some other things, for instance, All About Eve was kind of like on your plate for a while. This Hollywood as a theme is really interesting to you, I think, as I see as Hollywood, and as well as, but there's also something else that you once told me, which I think, especially, first of all, in terms of critics and the bad reception that you had sometimes, as well as the wonderful receptions you've had sometimes. And I asked you once about it, and you said something really so prophetic to me, which I always have to remember whenever I direct a play. And you said, remember, you're never as good as they say you are, but neither are you as bad as they say you are. I think that's a wonderful.
Well, it's true. If you're not going to believe the really bad reviews, then you can't really allow yourself to believe the really good ones either.
Yes.
And one of the great pieces of wisdom that Peggy Ramsey instilled in me when I was very, very young, she said, all real careers will have, failures, sections of, and you've just got to learn to ride all that and come back. She said, her example at the time was, she said, look at the career of Noel Coward, who I said, well, he's a huge success. She said, no, if you look at the career of Noel Coward, he had several disastrous failures, and he never let it bother him.
Very good, very good. I also, in Tales from Hollywood, you took as the main character Odon von Horvath,
yes,
who apparently in life died of a freak accident of some tree falling down on him in Paris, but you resuscitated him in Tales from Hollywood, and I think you have quite an interest in him, in Odon. Why is that?
Well, I came across this writer I was working in the theatre in Germany in the late 60s, and I read a play of his called Faith, Hope and Charity. And it was so up to the minute and contemporary in feeling that I assumed he was it was an anthology. And so he was in an anthology with other writers like Handke and Fassbinder and so on. And then I asked somebody, and they said, no, he died in the 30s. So I got very interested in him and started to read his plays. There are about 17 of them. And then I was invited in the mid 1970s. The National Theatre was built the new National Theatre was built on the south bank of the River Thames, and the inaugural season was obviously subject to huge attention. And they asked me to translate a play by a French writer called Marivaux. And I read it and said, honestly, I don't think, I think this is too delicate and difficult for me to translate. Do you know this writer called Odon von Horvath? And so in the first season of the National Theatre on the South Bank was a play called Tales from the Vienna Woods, which was directed by the actor Maximilian Schell, and was really the first big smash hit at the National Theatre, and went on to make a film of it in Vienna, and it started I did more plays of his. When I was writing Tales from Hollywood, the problem with the characters in Tales from Hollywood, with Brecht and Thomas Mann and Thomas Mann's brother Heinrich, was that they all hated each other, and they never spoke to, they tried to avoid each other as far as possible. So I needed a central character who would kind of be friends with all of them and tie them all together. And it dawned on me that Horvath, who died in 1938 in Paris in this freak accident in a thunderstorm when a branch of a tree fell on his head, was actually on his way to Los Angeles. Happened, and I thought, well, I'll just keep him alive for a few years, and that was the way the play resolved itself, because for a long time I couldn't work out how to write, how to build all this material together.
There was a, it's interesting that I don't think he's as well known in this country, but I know that another playwright and former client and friend of mine, Christopher Shin, translated a play of his called Judgment Day, which was done in New York.
Yes, I did that too. I did that at the Almeida, James MacDonald, about 10 years ago. It's a marvelous play. It's actually the play that caused a sort of Horvath revival after the war. It was the first of his plays to be done after the war, and it was a play that he never saw himself because the last few, of course, so many of his plays were banned by the Nazis, and this was one of them. So he never actually saw it. But I knew it was going on in New York. Of course, I wasn't there, so I didn't see it.
Yeah. So Horvath decided to stay in Nazi Germany and write. He had the chance to leave. Why do you think that's true? That's a fascinating decision. Yeah.
Well, I think he was last year. I had a play. I wrote a play based on one of his novels, which is called Youth Without God, which was done in London last year, and is about the Hitler Youth. And I had and this was a novel that he wrote in the mid-30s, after Hitler had come to power. And it was a novel which Thomas Mann wrote to him about and said, I don't understand how you found all these things out, but nobody has written as authentic a book as this about life in Nazi Germany. And I think there were a variety of reasons he stayed. He stayed because what was happening was so grotesque and ridiculous and unbelievably horrible that he was sort of attracted to it in some awful way. He couldn't tear himself away from this Nazi monstrosity that was going on around him. And it was, in the end, it was after they marched into Austria in 1938, he thought, okay, fine, I'll go. And he then only had as he didn't know this, but he only had a couple of months to live. But he had stayed. But I think he also felt very guilty about staying, because in order to stay and practice your profession, not that they would put on any of his plays, but in order to stay and practice your profession, you had to join the Nazi Party. So he had in fact joined the Nazi Party, which was a big shock to all his admirers in the 70s. When they found this out. But I think the reason was that he felt called to be a witness of these horrors.
Well, you once also this brings to mind something.
You've frozen on me.
You are that you were not in plays. Can you hear me? Oops.
I can now, but I didn't hear the question.
Difficulty. Oh, okay. So you once said to me that you were not interested in writing plays about the left versus the right. Rather, you are attracted to themes that dealt with the left and the problems it has with the center. And it seems like a lot of your characters, not just issues, but a lot of your characters are in that same dilemma. It's not black and white. It's how do I not get engaged when I must be engaged?
Well, I did think, I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if that's the case anymore. But in the 70s and 80s, it seemed to me that the real battleground was between liberals and radicals. I spent a lot of time trying to decide which side I was inclined to come down on. And sometimes I would want to come down on one side, and sometimes I would want to come down on another. And of course, that's very fruitful if you're writing plays to hold two opposing views and set them off against one another. So I wasn't ever really interested in drawing conclusions. I was just interested in posing the questions as clearly as possible. Now I think, of course, there's been a great sort of resurgence of the right wing and nationalism and so on. So that you know, one's thinking about all these things has slightly changed. In the last couple of years, I found myself writing much more about the kind of, you know, sometimes obliquely, but about the kind of nationalisms and you know, those distressing movements that look as if, you know, bear some resemblance to what was happening in the early 30s.
Yeah.
So the last 3 or 4 things that I've written, one was this adaptation about the Hitler Youth. One was a monologue for Maggie Smith, which was based on transcripts from one of Goebbels' secretaries, transcripts of interviews made when she was 102, not so long ago, actually, and that was about this, what we've just been talking about. It was about a woman who willfully, really, just tried not to, you know, just went to work and worked for Goebbels and tried not to see what was going on, and the fact that her Jewish friends were disappearing and those sorts of things. And with Letter from an Unknown Woman, which is the last but one play, I've relocated it from the 20s to the 30s, so it's about a Jewish writer and the problems of a Jewish writer in 30s Germany, Austria, in fact. And I've just finished. I started actually before all this most recent sort of racist upheavals in America. I wrote a play about which is called The Killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, about the civil rights worker who was killed by a state trooper in Alabama in 1965, whose death led to the Selma to Montgomery marches. Wow. And so those sorts of subjects, which are the new kind of a new palette to me, really, I think have been brought on by the drift of history that's happened in the last 10, 15 years.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yes, certainly. I think that's absolutely true. We haven't talked about Sunset Boulevard, for which you won a Tony for the lyrics in the book, and working with Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber. What was that collaboration with Don Black, who I think you said is a friend, and what was that like for you?
Well, it was the first time I'd written a musical, and I'm always interested in doing things I haven't done before. So, I'd known Andrew pretty much since we were teenagers, actually, because I was at school with Tim Rice. And at a certain point, you know, way back in the midst of history, they asked me if I would write the book of Jesus Christ Superstar. And I went round and listened to the demo tapes, which afterwards I said, well, they go on for more than 2 hours. Where's the book? Where's the book going to go? And so we had some further conversation. I said, I think you find that the story is well enough known. It's an opera. Just do it as an opera. So that's talking myself out of several millions. But the friendship continued, and then Andrew was kind enough to invite me to write the book and lyrics of Phantom of the Opera. And I said, you know, it's not really up my street. I didn't really respond to the material, but I tell you what I'd love to do is a musical of Sunset Boulevard, which was a film I adored. And about 7 or 8 years later, he came back to me, and he prudently put me with Don Black, because Don Black's such a skilled lyricist, and I'd never written lyrics before. But luckily, I got on so well with Don that we sat down and wrote the whole thing together, book and lyrics. And it was fun. A musical is very different, of course, from a stage play, a straight play because it's such a huge sort of industrial. It's more like a movie.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah, a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
tremendously good, enjoyable, tremendously good fun to do. You know, when it was revived a couple of years ago on Broadway with Glenn Close, I was able to sit back and think it's a really quite substantial piece of work, I think.
Yeah, quite. That's an interesting thing, though, that you just brought up. In terms of your technique, you've written for the stage. You have written 3 librettos with Philip Glass. You've written television series in England. Does your approach differ at all from when you're writing a play or writing a film or writing for television? Or do things change in terms of how you approach the different mediums in which you write?
Well, it's a difficult question in the sense that the answer is no. I don't. On the other hand, you have to understand that these are completely different mediums, and therefore, you know, writing a play is very different from writing a film, in the sense that a film, to be successful, a film has to have certain, you know, for want of a better word, certain cinematic qualities, which just as a play has to have certain theatrical qualities, so that it's a question of really sorting out in your mind. And I think whereas writing plays came for some reason relatively naturally to me, writing films took me a long time to figure out, and for 10 years I wrote screenplays that were really not very good, I don't think, and eventually I think in the mid 70s I thought, well, I'll have one last go at trying to write a film, and that was Carrington, and I took a year over it.
Sorry.
And but by the end of it I thought, oh, I'm sort of beginning to see the difference between the theatre and the cinema. And I also was lucky enough to work with some very distinguished directors. I spent a year working with Fred Zinnemann on a project. I spent a year working with David Lean on a Joseph Conrad adaptation of the novel Nostromo, which he was about to shoot when he died. And I learned an enormous amount from those 2 men, and from Stephen Frears, from lots of people that I'd worked with. And I think it was no coincidence that it was after I came straight out of a year working with David Lean and wrote the screenplay for Dangerous Liaison, which benefited from everything I'd learned, really.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you've worked with some extraordinary actors. Christian Bale, when he was 15, in Secret Agent.
Yes,
as well as Leonardo DiCaprio in Total Eclipse, when he was a young beginning actor, as well as, well, I could go on and on.
No, I love actors. I love actors, which is not always the case with writers. I have, you know, come across writers who don't really like actors, or are suspicious of them, or but I really love actors. I think it's a tremendously difficult job, and I admire them for doing it. And I've worked with some. I mean, Paul Scofield was my idol when I was a teenager, and to be able to work with him, not only on Uncle Vanya but on my play Savages in the 70s, was sort of unforgettable experience. And then I've worked. You know, we mentioned Maggie Smith just now. I worked with Maggie Smith. I worked with Ralph Richardson. I worked with 3 times now with Anthony Hopkins. You know, I've been really lucky with the actors I've worked with.
Yeah. I'm sure they must inspire you. There's one other thing that might inspire you. What are the writers that, let's say, are guiding lights in your career in terms of writers that have influenced you in terms of what you want to achieve in the course of your career, who would they be?
Well, when I started out, I was very influenced by John Osborne, as was everybody,
Yeah, yeah.
in the sense that my first play was an angry young man shouting at everybody and hogging the limelight. It was recognizably the progeny of John Osborne. But the
right.
writer who really influenced and helped me when I was very young was a writer now sadly largely forgotten, called David Mercer, who was
Yes.
a stage writer, but mostly a brilliant television writer. And he wrote some movies too. He wrote a movie called Morgan, and he wrote a movie called Family Life for Ken Loach. And he wrote a movie called for Alain Resnais. I just liked him. I liked him very, very much, and he took me under his wing, as it were, and I learned a lot from him. And then I think also when I came to start writing, when I was first hired to write a film, I had never actually seen a screenplay, so I didn't quite know how to approach writing a screenplay. So I went out and bought 5 screenplays by Harold Pinter. And I bought the 5 novels on which the screenplays were based. And I read the novels and I read the screenplays, that was a tremendous education. And I always admired Harold Pinter very, very much, and I liked him as well, and he was a friend. And he was formidable, slightly scary. But I think I was, and then of course, there are the classics, Chekhov.
Sure.
Chekhov really is my hero.
Sure. Well, gosh, from the age of 18 to what's happened, these are obviously very different, strange times, where with this pandemic, certainly the theater has got to take a pause. There's an intermission. It's very hard for theaters here because, yes, you can social distance in terms of the audience, but actors on stage wearing a mask, it's just, what does the future hold? God only knows. But
I'm hoping obviously everything's on pause at the moment, but as I'm going back, the theaters are opening in Europe now. And I'm going back to complete the opening of my play the beginning of October in Vienna, and slowly I think early next year it will. I don't in Vienna they're letting in 50% audiences, and I don't know whether it's that they have a kind of state subsidized system. And I don't know whether commercial theatres can afford to operate on that. But I mean, we have to hope that slowly it will start to come back. And I've certainly been, as I say, I've written a new play this summer, and I've also translated another of Florian Zeller's plays. And so I'm hoping there'll be theatres for them.
Right. So then what advice, given all that, conditions that we're facing right now, what words of wisdom would you have for someone young wanting to write for the theater? What would you advise someone who has aspirations to a career in the theater as a writer?
Well, I always say don't do it unless you can't possibly, unless you can't do anything else. Unless you have to do it, because it's a very rough profession in lots of ways, and with many disappointments and setbacks. Even when things are going well, things can go badly. If you see what I mean.
Yes.
So, I think that my main advice would be to actually go work in the theatre when you're young, when you're starting. Try and get a job, however menial, you know, even if it's selling programs or whatever, just to be in the theatre and to spend some time in the theatre and to go to rehearsals, which I was
Yeah.
allowed to go to when I first started at the Royal Court, which was it was amazing to watch Lindsay Anderson directing John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just sit in the stalls and watch, and you can't really learn. You know, I'm not a fan of those books that tell you how to write screenplays or those, you know, because actually what's interesting is what's original, and what's original of course can't be taught to you in manuals. But what you can get is you can sort of drink the atmosphere and somehow feel in your instincts what works and what doesn't work in the theatre by spending a lot of time in it. And I must say, one of the wisest things that was ever said to me was when Total Eclipse, which was eventually made into a film, as you said, with Leonardo DiCaprio, was my second play. Also very, very badly received by the critics. And during the rehearsals, we kind of knew that there were certain things wrong with it. And so William Gaskell, who was the artistic director, took the director of the play, Robert Kidd, and myself out to lunch. And we said to him, look, what tell us what we can do. How can we fix this play? It's not really quite. And he said to me, look, you're very young. He said, do the play as it is. Go and watch it a lot. The audience will tell you what's wrong with it.
Yes. Okay.
And then you can fix it later. Now, this is an inconceivably enlightened attitude in these days of workshop, where everything being workshopped to death, and nothing being put on until it's in its 97th draft. But what he said was true. I saw the play, it sort of marinated, and then 10 years later, I was able to rewrite it and fix those things, which I wouldn't have been able to fix on the fly during rehearsals.
Right.
I was able to fix it 10 years later and do it again.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent advice from someone that Academy Award. What's that?
Be patient is the other.
Be patient. And one day you can win an Academy Award for your work, or a Tony Award for your work, and God knows else, as well as being honored as a Knight of the Realm. We congratulate you on being the Queen, bestowing that honor on you. Did she tap you on the shoulder with her sword?
Unfortunately, the procedure was, it was a very pleasant surprise at the end of last year.
How did you find out?
You just get a letter. And you have to, there's a letter that comes and says, will you, if we offer it to you, will you accept it? Well, and then the ceremony was supposed to take place in April in Windsor, but unfortunately was interrupted by the virus. Okay. And some very, very smooth courtier rang me up and said that they would rearrange it as soon as it was practical.
Well, good. Congratulations, Sir Christopher Hampton. We thank you for your time. It's midnight, time to go to bed. You've been great for us. Thank you so much for volunteering. We love you.
It's been a great pleasure, Michael. It's lovely to see you. Thank you.
Oh, I just want to thank you both. This has been just an extraordinary interview, incredibly inspiring. I needed to hear this today. It was just so deeply beautiful and special, and I'm so grateful that we can share this with our beloved audience who we miss so much. And thank you both. I can't thank you enough. I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Everyone, thank you for being here. It's been a beautiful hour to spend together. If you're able, at the bottom of the screen with the arrows, you can make a donation if you're able to PRT during this time. And we hope to see you very soon, and be well. And we miss you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.